Welcome to my talk. My name is Stefan Dahm and I'm working and living in Tyrol in Austria. This talk was actually planned to be a poster at last year's Rio conference. As most of us, I also had to cancel flights and hotel. Well, 1 year later, the content of this presentation is already submitted as a manuscript in psychological research. Honestly, I expect at least one person in the audience being my reviewer. Please feel free to make use of this unique opportunity to ask some questions directly to the authors. For those who do not know me, I'm always interested in what drives motor learning after action imagery practice. So, which mechanisms lead to performance improvements and what exactly has been learned during practice. Today I'm going to talk about the acquisition of effector-dependent and effector-independent representations in motor sequence learning after action imagery practice and after action execution practice. You may have wondered already about the naming in the title. I will use the term action imagery practice throughout this presentation. You may better know this under the terms mental practice or motor imagery practice. This might actually be a point we could discuss in the warm-up phases of the upcoming RIA sessions. I personally have the feeling that the multimodal aspects become clearer in the term action imagery than in the term motor imagery. Motor imagery is sometimes used to emphasize the kinesthetic aspects of imagery. However, the visual aspects and also other modalities are similarly important for the type of imagery that we are all investigating. Further, I believe that action imagery stands quite nicely next to action observation and action execution. Anyway, with action imagery practice, I refer to the repeated use of action imagery in order to improve motor performance. As all of you might know, this works, but not as good as action execution practice. A simple reason for this is that in executed practice, actual feedback is available, whereas in imagery practice, feedback needs to be imagined. To give an example, if you practice dart throwing physically, you can see where the dart has landed on the board. If you mentally practice dart throwing, you need to imagine where the dart is landing. However, action imagery practice seems to equalize those deficits when it comes to the acquisition of effector-independent representations. Effector-independent representations are investigated with the intermanual transfer paradigm. In this paradigm, subjects usually practice a unimanual movement with one single hand. Later, after practice, they are tested in the unpracticed transfer hand. It has often been shown that practice in one hand leads to performance improvements in the other hand. Such performance improvements in the transfer hand are similar in action imagery practice and action execution practice. In the present study, we differentiate between three types of representations. Effector-independent visual spatial representations have an extrinsic environment-based reference frame. So, this can be tested with a movement in the transfer hand that has the same visual spatial coordinates. Effector-independent internal representations have an intrinsic body-based reference frame. So, this can be tested with a movement in the transfer hand that uses homologous muscles. In external space, these are mirror movements of the original. Effector-dependent representations are required if the practice hand profits more from practice than a transfer hand. In action execution practice, it has been observed that effector-independent internal representations evolve at later stages of learning than effector-independent visual spatial representations. We were now interested in whether this is also observable in action imagery practice. Alternatively, it could be that internal representations evolve even later in action imagery practice than in action execution practice, or that internal representations do not evolve at all in action imagery practice. Similarly, effector-dependent representations may not evolve in action imagery practice. Let's have a look at the task that we were using. Participants installed the experiment on their personal notebooks. By this, they were able to practice at home. They all received a package of stickers which they could stick on the number keys of their keyboard. Before each trial, participants were indicated which hand to use. In the starting position, they kept the spacebar pressed. At the screen of their notebooks, starting lights were presented, which were similar to those in Formula 1. The starting procedure was repeated if they started too early. With the lights turning green, they were supposed to press their labeled number keys from 0 to 9 and to go back to the space key as fast as possible. We measured the movement time, which is the interval between the release of the space key and the final press of the space key. The study involved 6 testing sessions. Each session started with a test. The tests are shown below in gray. They involved 4 sequences which were performed with the left and right hand each. Due to reliability reasons, each sequence was performed 3 times in each test. The first 4 sessions included a practice phase of 60 repetitions of the practice sequence. The action imagery practice group released the spacebar, imagined to press the assigned keys from 0 to 9 and pressed the spacebar at the moment they imagined coming back to it. The action execution practice group performed the task as described earlier. The control practice group executed the movement, but the order of the numbers was aligned from left to right or the reverse. I will now introduce you into the main results. Effect sizes and p-values of the effects of the ANOVA with the factors practice group, session, sequence and hand will be available in the upcoming manuscript. The results showed a general improvement from session to session, which may indicate an adaptation to the task requirements. For instance, improved finger coordination. Let's go together through the graph. The y-axis shows the movement times. On the bottom you can find the 6 sessions in each of the practice groups: action imagery practice, action execution practice and control practice. Gray lines indicate performance in the transfer hand and black lines performance in the practice hand. The squares and the lines which are the lowest indicate the practice sequence. The mirror and different sequence are the lines that are all one above the other. In the practice hand, sequence-specific learning was observed after both action execution practice and action imagery practice. This was indicated by shorter movement times in the practice sequence than in the other sequences. Such sequence-specific learning was stronger after action execution practice than after action imagery practice. In the transfer hand, movement times were also shorter in the practice sequence than in a different sequence, which indicates effector-independent representations of the sequence. Such representations were visual spatial in nature, as this was observed for the practice sequence but not for the mirror sequence, which involved homologous muscles. In action execution practice, movement times in the practice sequence were shorter in the practice hand than in the transfer hand. This indicated effector-dependent representations in action execution practice, but not in action imagery practice. In regards to the time course of learning, sequence learning was stronger and faster in action execution practice than in action imagery practice. Finally, we did not observe improvements in the mirror sequence that would have gone beyond to the improvements of the different sequence. Hence, effector-independent intrinsic representations were not observed at all, which means not even after action execution practice. Maybe other types of tasks that are more body-centered may lead to such representations. What we did observe were effector-independent visual spatial representations. They were observed in both action execution practice as well as in action imagery practice. Effector-dependent representations, however, were observed in action execution practice but not in action imagery practice. That's it for now. I'm looking forward to your questions and recommendations. If there is not enough time, you may also write me an email.